I was reading an essay last night in a book called The Mind's Eye, edited by Dennett and Hofstadter. This particular essay was called, well, actually I can't remember what it was called. It was by Harold Morowitz, something like that. I'll try and remember the title, but I'm not sure if I'm going to get it. But this particular essay, which was it was quite an old essay. It's from 1980, and I think it was originally published in Psychology Today magazine, so it wasn't a peer-reviewed journal article. But it was, the content of it was to do with, well, it was to do with several things. Firstly, it was to do with the idea of scientific reductionism as a practice, as a kind of philosophy of understanding. I'm saying quite rightly that it's enormously successful, and actually not really questioning it. There's always been any reason to, really. But basically saying that the traditions of reductionism are that complex systems can be understood in terms of the behavior, the laws, the mechanisms which are operating within the smaller scale components that make up that system. And those components in turn, or the operations of those components in turn, can be understood in terms of the laws, the mechanisms which make up the components of those. So you're working at smaller and smaller scales each time, and the operations of things that are at the smallest scale ultimately determine the operations of all the scales above that. Now I don't know, as I say, this article is from 1980. I don't know to what extent that idea is still valid. You certainly hear things like it's to do with emergent behaviour, or to do with strange attractors, or to do with complexity and tipping points, and all those kind of things which seem to suggest the kinds of operations. But I think that reductive explanation is incredibly powerful. But what this article was saying, it wasn't really focusing on that. What it was talking about was about what at the time Morowitz reckoned was a kind of tendency within biology and psychology, which was the theme of the overall book, to look toward reductive processes, ultimately physical processes in physics, which weren't actually what physics was talking about. The image that he presented was of two trains going in opposite directions, so that researchers in psychology, consciousness studies, biology would be looking to explain the features of consciousness, let's say. You would look to biology, you would look to chemistry, you would look to physics, and ultimately you would look to quantum physics as the best explanatory tool for working at small scale, and seeing that absolutely as a kind of reductive process working towards, a highly mechanistic explanation of consciousness. What he was citing was the tendency at the time, certainly, within physics, to kind of look toward, when you're looking towards quantum physics, to actually start to look to consciousness explanations of that. And he was citing people like Schrödinger, and other physicists. And I guess I would also cite people like David Bohm, Fritjof Capra, people like that who've made that kind of strange sideways move, and more recently in terms of hypothesis from neuroscientific accounts of consciousness. You would look to people like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, all of whose work I have to say I think is deeply suspect. I don't find it terribly convincing myself. I mean, I'm not a physicist, what do I know? But I don't find it terribly convincing. It seems to me it's just an attempt to explain one unknown in terms of another. But I may be completely wrong in that. But the point where I'm going for with this is that reductive tendency, is that quest to move towards smaller and smaller units of explanation, to look towards finer and finer grained explanatory mechanisms in order to explain larger explanatory mechanisms. And I'm reminded of a couple of things about that. I mean, firstly, the first thing is just a question, how small can you get? Is there an ultimate kind of limit to that? I know there's a kind of Higgs boson answer to that question, I guess. But I can't imagine this is probably a failure of my imagination, but I can't imagine what kind of an explanation you would give for the workings of an ultimately small particle, ultimately small field of operations that would account for everything above it without having to say, well, this ultimately small particle has got structure. And as soon as it's got structure, then you know it's the ultimate. So that's, for me, a little bit of a logistical problem, which, again, as I say, is probably just a failure of my ability to imagine what kind of a solution you get. But certainly, as a kind of addendum to that, I'm reminded of a number of other pieces of writing which had kind of addressed that, and which kind of Morowitz is going to. I think his attempt to kind of link something as large and complex, apparently large and complex as consciousness, to the workings of the quantum mechanical world is a kind of an attempt to draw a circularity there. You're saying that this very large thing you're trying to explain, consciousness, is ultimately connects up to itself at the quantum level. So you go through, if you say consciousness is a biological function, and you explain biology in terms of, you're explaining consciousness in terms of biology, explaining biology in terms of chemistry, explaining chemistry in terms of physics, you're explaining physics in terms of quantum mechanics, and you're explaining quantum mechanics in terms of consciousness. That's kind of where he's going with that, which, as I say, is probably dubious. But that idea of a circularity is very engaging. And other places I've found that is in, what's it called? There's a book called The View from the Center of the Universe by Joel Primack and Nancy Abrams, I think it's called. Joel Primack is a cosmologist. I think he was involved in dark energy research. And one of the things that they talk about in that is the prospect of there being a connection between the infinite and the infinitesimal. And they're kind of gesturing towards things like superstrings as possible explanatory mechanisms. And they refer to that circle of physical expression, if you like, physical mechanism, working at different scales, as the Cosmic Ouroboros. So there we are, working at the scales we are, with the kind of Newtonian mechanics that we tend to walk around in, halfway around the circle. And the infinitely large connects up to the infinitely small, theoretically, with the head of the Uroboros, the head of the cosmic serpent, kind of swallowing its infinitesimal tail, just as a kind of memory device. And I think I've seen that Uroboros somewhere else, actually. I'm trying to think of this as a reference I had for it. I can't locate it, but certainly somewhere else I've seen that. And I know it features within Francisco Varela's writing as a kind of signal for re-entry, although that may be completely different to what I'm talking about here. But the other thing it reminds me of, which is nothing to do with science and nothing to do with consciousness, is the closing scene from one of my favourite films, which is The Incredible Shrinking Man, which is a marvellous film. It sets up some kind of spurious situation. This guy is out in the ocean in his yacht, and he gets irradiated or something, or he sails through this cloud of chemicals, and it affects his body, so he starts diminishing. So he starts off going to the size of a child, and he goes to the size of a doll, then he's the size of a mouse and the size of an insect. And it's all first-person narrated. But the closing scene of that is him stepping through the grid of the little air vent in the cellar that he's been pretty much confined to while he's been very small. And he steps out through this small little air vent into the world, and there's this fantastic monologue where he just looks up at the stars, and he says that the infinite and the infinitesimal are ultimately the same thing. And I think his last line is something like, "I'm still alive." It's just a fantastic thing. Anyway, I don't really know where I'm going with all that, but it just seems to me there's something quite interesting about this, the idea of scale, the idea of reduction, the idea that we look to things that are within complex mechanisms we look to components, the components of those mechanisms and the interactions between those components in terms of laws and mechanisms to explain how the complex system will work, and maybe that dotted line between the whole and the part progressively going smaller and smaller, or progressively going larger and larger. Maybe they ultimately meet up somewhere. It'd be nice to think they did. It'd be very interesting.